Welcome to the show. I'm Antisocial. And this is the Antisocial Network.
I want to talk to her, but my face is up against the wall. Yeah, I think she wants to talk to me, but I'm antisociable. Yeah.
This week, I discuss the alarming rise in anti-Asian violence, Trump's role in fomenting racism, and how the Asian American struggle parallels the Black Lives Matter movement. Thanks for tuning in. Lately, there has been a disturbing uptick in violence perpetrated against Asian people in the United States, and we need to talk about it. Fueled by anti-Asian rhetoric surrounding COVID-19 with the use of terms like the China virus and Kung flu, some Americans have felt emboldened to commit hate crimes against any Asian person they come across. Frequently, the victims are elderly. Many Asian Americans have spoken out, fearing for their safety and the safety of family members, and calling for solidarity from the community. Representative Grace Meng from New York recently pleaded to news outlets saying, "Give me confirmation that I'm American too. Our people are getting attacked. Our people are getting harassed, spat on, beat up, slashed. Please, somebody pay attention. Please notice us." If you haven't heard about the rise in cases of anti-Asian violence, just do a quick internet search. There has been an alarming number of violent attacks in recent months. 84-year-old Visha Ratanapakdee, a native of Thailand who lived in San Francisco, died several weeks ago after being shoved to the ground. The incident drew national attention as it had been caught on camera. Also in the Bay Area, a man shoved 3 people in Oakland's Chinatown neighborhood, injuring all 3 victims, a 91-year-old man, a 60-year-old man, and a 55-year-old woman. Last month, a 52-year-old Chinese-American woman in New York was cursed at and also shoved to the ground when she asked a man about the line outside a bakery. Also in New York, a 61-year-old Asian man was slashed across the face with a box cutter on the subway. Recently, an Asian family in the wealthy community of Ladera Ranch in Orange County, California, were victims to visits almost nightly of people who would bang on their doors and windows, shout, and generally disturb the peace. The family, who has 2 young children who have been scared to sleep in their own beds for months, called upon neighbors in their community who now take shifts posted outside the home every night to ward off troublemakers. In addition to facing increased violence, the Asian American community is experiencing a secondary assault from people who don't want to characterize these attacks as race-related. Adding insult to injury, the Manhattan DA's office declined to charge a man who stabbed an Asian man in the back in New York's Chinatown last month as a hate crime. Sources state the victim was stabbed for, quote, "no reason," but authorities refuse to go as far as to classify it as racially motivated. The community disagrees. In response to the attack in Chinatown, a rally of hundreds in New York turned out in a showing of multi-ethnic solidarity and an effort to rise up against anti-Asian hate. The Manhattan DA refusing to prosecute on hate crime charges isn't a singular incident of pushback from non-believers who want to deem these acts of terror random and isolated. When 84-year-old Visha Ratanapakdee was shoved to the ground by a 19-year-old, killing him, authorities also wanted to claim it was an isolated incident, unrelated to race, but his family knows otherwise. Visha's son-in-law asked a news organization regarding the assailant, what else could have motivated him? While there was certainly a spike in anti-Asian sentiment during the SARS pandemic of 2003, it did not compare to the increase in violence we're seeing currently. Recent police reports indicate that hate crimes against Asian Americans are up 150% in major cities. Brian Lehrer of WNYC reported on his show that there have been more than 500 of these incidents in New York City since the beginning of 2020, and the Asian American Bar Association of New York estimates that there have been more than 2,500 anti-Asian hate incidents nationwide between March and September of 2020. That's an estimated 2,500 hate crimes in the first 7 months since the pandemic hit the United States. A recently formed organization called Stop AAPI Hate, AAPI, that's Asian American and Pacific Islander, aims to document incidents of anti-Asian racism and violence in America. Stop AAPI Hate collects data from self-reporters who often have not contacted police and estimates that there have been nearly 3,000 cases of hate incidents towards Asian Americans since March of 2020 alone. In the midst of rising violence against Asians in the wake of COVID-19, former presidential candidate Andrew Yang called upon Asians in America to wear red, white, and blue in order to combat the virus. In essence, he felt he needed to tell Asian Americans that their safety may depend on being visibly pro-American right now. It is undeniable that Trump's anti-Asian rhetoric has emboldened some Americans to commit acts of violence, but discrimination against Asians in the United States is not new. Unfortunately, America has a long history of anti-Asian sentiment. According to a PBS article on the history of anti-Asian racism in America, the United States has often regarded Asian immigrants as a model minority due to their economic success. However, Asian Americans have always been treated as a threat in a nation that largely promotes a whites-only immigration policy. As early as the 1800s, Asians in America were declared a, quote, yellow peril and deemed unfit for United States citizenship. This led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. By the 1850s, many Chinese immigrants had migrated to America because of the gold rush and were instrumental contributors to many industrial jobs, including agriculture, the garment industry, and factory work. Chinese laborers were largely responsible for building the railway system of the west coast of the United States. But as the Chinese labor force grew, so did anti-Chinese sentiment, leading to the ban on Chinese immigration in 1882. While meant to only last 10 years, the Chinese Exclusion Act was made permanent in 1902 and was not abolished until 1943. To this day, it remains the only law in the United States implemented for the sole purpose of preventing members of a specific ethnic group or nationality from immigrating to the United States. Continuing into the 1900s, anti-Asian sentiment and typical American imperialism paved the way for the United States to continue their rule over the Philippines, a formal colony of the United States at the time, justifying their occupation by pointing to Filipinos' supposed uncivilized and unruly society. Then, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, FDR signed Executive Order 9066 in 1942, calling for the immediate imprisonment of suspected enemies, but in actuality resulted in the mass internment of 120,000 people of Japanese descent. Later still, anti-Asian racism, specifically anti-Vietnamese sentiment, continued in America with the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War. So, while Trump was a contributing factor in fomenting anti-Asian hatred in the United States, it cannot be ignored that racism towards Asian Americans has always existed in our country's history. Let's go to break. We'll return to this in a little bit.
Are you tired of at-home tattoo treatments that leave your spouse disappointed and your skin infected? Do you want the professional look of your local tattoo artist, but their shop is out of range of your ankle monitor? If you've got that itch to get some new ink but can't afford the high prices of qualified artists every paycheck, then you need Madison Bleed. Started by a mom and named after her daughter's horrible tattoo, you too can use Madison Bleed to fix your fuck-ups at home. Not just for cover-ups, Madison Bleed is perfect for the novice tattooist and comes with a tracing guide for sparrows, semicolons, and foreign language symbols. Start designing your quality at-home tattoos today with Madison Bleed.
Hello, friends. I'm your Vitamita Vegemin girl. Are you tired, run down, listless? Do you poop out at parties? Are you unpopular? The answer to all your problems is in this little bottle. Vitamita Vegemin. Yes, Vitamita Vegemin contains vitamins, meat, vegetables, and minerals. Yes, with Vitamita Vegemin, you can spoon your way to health. All you do is take a great big spoonful after every meal. It's so tasty, too. Tastes just like candy. So why don't you join all the thousands of happy, peppy people and get a great big bottle of Vitamita Vegemin tomorrow. That's Vitamita Vegemin. Welcome back. One of Biden's first acts in office was to sign an executive order that condemns anti Asian racism and calls on agencies to rid official documents of racist language. The order also indicates a more rigorous effort to address hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans. In the months since he signed it, however, there have been countless news reports of more violent attacks. Actors Daniel Wu and Daniel Dae Kim recently drew attention to the rise of anti Asian violence by offering a $25,000 reward for information regarding the attack on a 91-year-old man in Oakland. In a statement to media, the two said, "We felt so exasperated and frustrated that somehow this wasn't escaping the echo chamber of the Asian American community, and so we wanted to raise the stakes." There has been some fear that increased awareness surrounding recent anti Asian violence will fuel anti Blackness in the Asian community. Though only some of the perpetrators in recent attacks have been Black, and research shows that racism against Asian Americans is perpetrated by a diverse range of ethnicities, some have pointed out how recent events could exacerbate race relations between the Black and Asian communities. Jeff Chang, writer and cultural critic from the San Francisco Bay Area, described on the Today Explained podcast the juxtaposition of the Black civil rights movement and the Asian fight for civil rights in America. When asked about Asian Americans being regarded as a model minority, Chang says you have to kind of look at that in relationship to the rise of the modern day civil rights movement, of course, coming from the Black freedom struggle, which itself dates back 400 years plus. And people who are against the Black freedom struggle saying, "Why is it that you minorities are making so much noise? Why don't you look at the Asian Americans? These folks are quiet, they keep their head down, and they're becoming exactly the kind of folks that we in the US believe you can be if you just follow the right path." Popularized by Reagan in the 80s, the idea of a model minority is one that paints Asian Americans as diligent, quiet, and hardworking. An NPR article titled "Model Minority Myth Again Used as a Racial Wedge Between Asians and Blacks" details the problematic nature of this mindset. The article points to a piece by New York Times writer Andrew Sullivan, in which Sullivan tries, incorrectly, to assert that because Asian immigrants in America are successful, that the reason Black people in America struggle cannot be due to racism. Framing Asian Americans in this way has always been a tool used to disparage other minorities, usually Blacks. On Today Explained, Jeff Chang continues, "Asian Americans are always the model minority in comparison to somebody else." He says, "There's this sort of existential crisis that Asian Americans find themselves in, which is that we're kind of in between. We're pitted in between whites and Blacks, and you find yourself defining yourself in relationship to whiteness or in relationship to Blackness, because that's in so many ways how the racial hierarchy has been set up in the US." Chang describes the fragile dynamic between which Black and Asian Americans are viewed, as well as how they view each other. He says, if you're looking now at kind of the primary lens through which Black and Asian relationships are seen, it has to do with the images that attended the 1992 Los Angeles uprisings, in which Blacks were criminalized and Asians were seen as sort of surrogate whites. And that has been the frame through which we've seen any video that includes Asian faces and Black faces in them, and I think it continues to be that frame. And so we, in this particular moment, I think, are living kind of with this narrative that Blacks and Asian Americans don't get along, that we're cat and mouse, or we're natural enemies. Chang then points out that while perpetrators of anti-Asian violence come from all backgrounds, one video depicting a Black assailant can be circulated in the community, stirring existing discrimination, the way video of Latasha Harlins, a 15-year-old Black girl who was shot by a Korean store owner in 1992 and whose death helped lead to the LA riots, contributed to tensions between Blacks and Asians in Southern California at the time. He says it's very easy to be able to play into this established media narrative of, it's the Blacks and the Asians who are fighting again. A political journalist from Vox echoed this concern on the Today Explained podcast. When discussing solutions, she said, "One of the tensions that has already emerged is the question of how big of a role does policing play in the response to this? And for many of the communities that have been particularly affected, organizers in those communities have emphasized that they don't want that to be the solution and the end-all approach to these incidents of violence because of how policing has disproportionately harmed Black Americans and continues to do so." She explained that the Black Lives Matter movement and the fight for Asian American equality can coexist and share similar struggles, saying, "The push has been, let's have solidarity among people of color to fight this problem, and let's be allies for one another in each other's respective movements." In today's climate of ongoing civil rights action across America, Organizers are urging communities to come together and not further alienate or segregate marginalized groups who could be allies. Kat Shea, an anti hate training coordinator at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Chicago, spoke about this on the 21st Show podcast. I think there is some sort of movement to be able to connect all of this and be able to bring it to the conversations about racism, harassment, and white supremacy, she said while discussing the rise of anti Asian violence. Like the recent multi ethnic rally organized in New York in response to the violence perpetrated against a man in Chinatown, we need to see more acts of solidarity. As we have learned all too well in the past year, silence is violence, and so we need to continue to shine light on this issue, talk about it, and support our Asian American community. If you see something, say something. Show up for your friends and neighbors, share and repost Asian voices, and refuse to accept apathy in the face of this growing violence, both from yourself and our elected officials. That's the show for this week. I'm Antisocial, and this is the Antisocial Network. If you enjoy my podcast, please rate and review me in iTunes. If you want even more access to me, Antisocial, follow me on Instagram at the Antisocial Network. Catch me on the app Stereo, and subscribe to my Patreon for only $5 to receive 2 bonus episodes a month. See you next Wednesday. Later!
But I'm antisociable, yeah. Antisociable.